love the beautiful fabrics that are designed by Kaffe Fassett. Hi, I'm Susan from Sewfeet.com, and this video is about my latest art quilt that starts with his fabrics. When I saw this quote from Kaffe, it made me want to take his fabrics and add to them. In the past, I've added solids to kind of tone them down a little bit. This time, I decided to bring more color and more texture to the party. I created a small wall hanging, 16 inches by 16 inches, using his fabrics, and then I added ribbons, trims, laces, anything that could add texture and color to the quilt. I started with 16 5-inch fabric squares and then cut 16 5-inch batting squares for my favorite quilt as you go technique. I also gathered up as many trims, laces, ribbons, yarn, any kind of fiber that I could use to embellish this quilt. You can use just about any color thread for the quilting because everything seems to blend with his fabrics, but I chose a variegated thread that really worked with the colors in the fabrics. To begin, we're going to quilt the 16 squares, and you want to put a piece of batting behind each fabric square, and then you can quilt it any way you like. I did a very simple quilting technique with the serpentine stitch, and I just randomly stitched across the surface of the fabric to give it a quilted look. Once you finish the quilting, you want to trim the square to 4 inches by 4 inches. And the next thing you'll do is repeat those 2 steps with the remaining 15 squares. To join the squares, you're going to have 4 rows of 4 squares, and you're going to place them side by side and zigzag them together. I use an edge stitch foot with the center guide, and that guide goes between the 2 squares and it keeps them from overlapping as you are stitching. Once you have 4 rows of 4 squares, you want to stitch the rows together in the same way, and now we have our quilt top that we're going to embellish. To cover the zigzag stitching, you're going to use an assortment of ribbons that are 1/2 inch to 5/8 inch wide, and I used the edge stitch foot to stitch along each long edge of the ribbon to hold it in place. Next, you'll add more embellishments on top of those ribbons. I laid trims, ribbons, and other fibers, yarns, whatever I had on hand, on top of the ribbons so that I could audition them and see what I wanted to put where. You can put other ribbons that are more narrow on top of these ribbons, sewing them in place with the decorative stitch. You can also couch yarns and other fibers using a braiding foot and a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch to hold it in place. All of the remaining embellishments are going to be placed on the quilt before the backing is added. You want to make sure to keep everything at least 1/2 inch away from the raw edge of the quilt so that you'll have plenty of room to do the binding. Next, we're going to add some dimension to the quilt by creating and attaching art clusters. These are just little stacks of fabric, paper, buttons, labels. Yours will look different than mine, of course, because you won't have the same supplies that I do. There is a link for a free printable that tells you what materials and supplies work for this. It's really a lot of little leftover pieces of things that you put together to create interesting pieces of art. Once you've created your clusters, you can place them, arrange them any way you want to on the quilt, and stitch them or glue them in place. There is also a printable that has the quote, and I printed it on a light colored decorative cardstock scrapbooking paper. And then I used several different colors of ink that I just swiped across the paper and along the edges just to give it a little more character. I added a colored piece of cardstock as kind of a background for this. And put the buttons on top. You can stitch the buttons through the 2 layers of cardstock. You can also stitch the buttons through the cardstock, the quilt top, and the batting. I stitched the corners of the quote with a straight stitch just at an angle to hold it to the quilt. The last embellishment we're going to do before we finish up the backing and the binding is what I call a fiber tassel. It's kind of a fun little project you can do using some of your trims, laces, yarn, and other fibers. There's a link below for a separate video that shows you how to make this fiber tassel. This tassel is about 7 inches long from top to bottom, and you can place it anywhere you want on your quilt. To attach the tassel to the quilt, I took a couple of pieces of narrow yarn and I bar tacked them at the place where I wanted the tassel to be. Then I just tied the yarns together in a double knot and let the yarn hang down and become part of the tassel. We're ready for the binding, but before I put binding on, I usually prepare the edges. I use an overlock foot and an overlock stitch just to kind of wrap around the edges and seal them. It makes it easier to manage the layers as you attach the binding. And you can see here how the overlock stitch compresses the edges and makes it flatter so there's less bulk. The final step in making this quilt is the binding, which is true in most quilts, but the binding step I'm using is different than most quilts. It is a single layer of binding and it has raw edges. I cut 4 strips of binding, 1 1/4 inch wide and 18 inches long, which is a little bit larger than the edge that you're going to use it on, and you'll trim it to fit when you get the binding on. One edge of the binding is straight and the other is cut with a decorative rotary cutter. You could also use pinking shears if you wanted that look. I stitched the straight edge to the back of the quilt and wrapped it around to the front so that the decorative edge would show on the front of the quilt. I finished it by stitching it down with the running stitch. You could do any decorative stitch you want or even a straight stitch. After you bind the sides, you'll bind the upper edge and the lower edge, and then you'll be finished with your quilt. Thanks for watching my video, and I hope that you're inspired to make your own art quilts. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. I have more videos to come, and as always, happy stitching!